This video is brought to you by patreon.com/worsttake. Get access to exclusive live streams and Discord servers, on-screen shoutouts, and early access to some videos when you join now. Help make sure that we can continue to make content like this by supporting the Patreon. Links are in the description down below. One of the questions I get asked the most about the Cleveland Browns is about Deshaun Watson. Now, it's interesting to me that I get less questions of people who are curious about Deshaun Watson's level of play, more so than I get questions about what it is that Deshaun Watson has to do to change the current narrative about him. Now, before we talk about how he changes the narrative, I do think we need to discuss what the current narrative is for Deshaun Watson. And the current narrative is of Deshaun Watson. And look, I don't think this narrative is necessarily true from an on-field standpoint, but this is the narrative that's out there. This is the lens that most people, especially the people further away from the Cleveland Browns organization and distance and job description, those people tend to have this narrative about Deshaun Watson, that he's been a failure over 2 years, that he has not come close to looking like he did in 2020, and that he's a shell of himself physically, mentally, and everything else in between, and that the Browns paid $230 million for Lemon. That is the current narrative. That is the lens that people look at it. That is, when you see things through that lens, things like the Browns might go 6-10 after going 11-6 with a heavily injured roster, you get how those takes get made, right? Or people predicting that the Browns are going to go and be worse, even though they probably aren't going to deal with the same amount of injuries that they had last year. But people are predicting that they're going to be worse. And how does that happen? It doesn't really make much sense from our point of view, because we don't really view it like that for the most part, but they do, right? The other half, the people, especially the national people, do view it like that. And that's the narrative about Deshaun Watson. Now, look, a ton of things go into that. Some of this stuff, most of this stuff is about his reputation off the field, and I am not here to defend his reputation off the field. I could care less about his reputation off the field. But this channel does focus on football, and we're talking about what his reputation should be on the field and how can he change the narrative about it. Now, one of the main reasons that the narrative from diehard Browns fans versus national media people is very different is because of the simple truth that we actually watch those Browns games when they happen. National media people, unless the game is on national TV, usually don't. Why is that important, right? You could go back and watch the game on a 40-minute cut up. You can go back and watch the game, the full broadcast, a 3-hour cut of it. We have so much technology that it shouldn't matter that you watch the game late, right? On tape delay or whatever it is, or however people are catching up with the game. Or maybe you're just watching the game on all 22. But you miss a lot of stuff when you only watch the game in condensed, or you only watch the highlights, or even if you watch the full replay. There's a reason why people are willing to do so much ridiculous stuff to make sure that they catch their favorite team's game live versus tape. Because we know that if we watch it live, we're getting the full experience, the full context, as much as possible that we can get from behind a television screen. We're getting that. But when you watch it on tape delay, there's some context that you're missing. How are people reacting in the moment to every play? What is the general vibe of the game? What's the feeling? What is the natural flow of the game? These are things that you feel and understand when you're watching a game live. And then some stats come up and you go, well, that doesn't make sense because that's not what I felt when I watched the game. And you have a different contextualization for that game, right? Like viewing it live is seriously a bit of context that I think a lot of people miss who cover this team nationally. You also get the context of knowing what's the weather like? Is the weather a problem, right? Because sometimes when you watch a condensed version, the weather doesn't show up great on screen. Or maybe if you watch the replay, the weather doesn't show up great on screen, and maybe the broadcast team doesn't do a great job of it. But if you're watching a game live, you might be scrolling on Twitter, you might see a video about how crazy the wind is, you might get that additional information. And all of that, right, is why there is this gap between people who watched a ton of Deshaun Watson in this year and don't have this doomsday feel about him. I don't think the feeling is like necessarily over the moon. Oh my God, he's going to be back to 2020 if he just stays healthy. But I do think that people are like, hey, he was fine when he was in there, right? Like he was a very winnable quarterback. They were able to win games with him. You didn't get the high end numbers that you wanted, but also he didn't play more than 3 games in a row. So it's kind of hard to expect those things or get those things when he has no consistency with the offense and the offense has no consistency with him just flat out being out there. But again, when you look at the season on a spreadsheet, absent of all that context, all of that goes away. Which brings me back to my main point. How does Deshaun Watson change the narrative? It's the same way any player in the NFL changes the narrative about them. You think about narratives in the NFL. They're not created on Sundays at 1 o'clock. Hell, for the most part, they're not created at Sundays at 4 o'clock. They're created at 8 o'clock on Sundays, at 8 o'clock on Thursdays, at 8 o'clock on Mondays. The key to changing the perception, the narrative about any player is how they perform on national TV. You have a good game on national TV, people give you the benefit of the doubt for years. You have a bad game on national TV or 2 bad games in a season on national TV, it's open season on your reputation. See, Deshaun Watson had 5 games that he really played in, right? We're not going to count that Indy game where he played 2 drives. He had 5 games he really played in. I thought he was pretty good, fine enough in the Cincinnati game. I thought he was pretty good in that Tennessee game. I thought he was pretty good in that Arizona game. And I thought he was pretty good, all things considered, especially that last half that he had against Baltimore. So overall, he was pretty good for most of the year. The problem is that he did have one game where he did look washed, where he did look like a burden, where he looked like a shell of himself, where he looked awful, where he looked like the guy that people write the narratives about now. You know what game that is, right? The Monday Night Football game versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. The one time everybody watched Deshaun Watson and got that context, right? That's so important with the football game. It was a horrible experience. It was his worst game I can believe he's ever played, especially in the NFL. And that's the taste that was left in the mouth. He got hurt, didn't play national again. Next time you saw the Browns on national TV, Joe Flacco threw for 345 yards. It's easy to see how this narrative got formed. Because, yeah, for us, we watched 17 games of the Browns. And those 17 games have created a lot of different samples because you only got 5 of Deshaun, you only got 2 here, 2 here, 2 here. And then after the season ends, a lot of that context goes away because we're not thinking about that stuff anymore. We're not engaging with it as intensely anymore. So it gets lost. But one thing, one impression that does stick for whatever reason is a national TV game. Maybe because the brights are light. Maybe because it just looks different than every other game you play. And it feels different than every other game. It feels like a big deal when you're on a national TV stage. But if you play well on national TV, that sticks. If you don't play well on national TV, that sticks too. And the one issue that Deshaun Watson had in 2024, outside of being injured for most of it, was that his one bad game, well, it's the one that everybody saw. Not everybody saw him come back, throw 14 straight passes, and beat the Baltimore Ravens on the road. We saw it. Some of us are moved by it, sure. They didn't see it. A lot of them didn't see how well he played versus the Titans and Arizona Cardinals. What they did see, though, was that one pass that he threw backwards to Elijah Moore and almost blew the game up. See? You know, not a lot. That's Bengals game was at 1:00 on a Sunday. I really saw it. They just saw the stat sheet, right? And they looked at the stat sheet, saw under 200 yards. Oh, he must have had a bad game. They didn't see the fact that he ran in the game clinching touchdown, that he controlled the game pretty well from a quarterback position. They didn't understand the context of the weather. We saw it. We kind of understand it. And those of us who are inclined to look at this fairly kind of go, okay, yeah, he was fine in that game. I don't think anybody thinks he was great in that game, but he was fine. He was fine most of the games he was in. Sometimes better than fine. Sometimes part of the reason you won. When I hear people say Deshaun Watson was not the part of the reason that the Browns won any of the games that he played in, I'm like, that's just false. Right? But that's such a part of the narrative right now, which is, oh, Deshaun Watson wasn't the reason they won any of these games. As if going 14 for 14 at the end of that Baltimore game, like, did not help the Browns win that game. As if Deshaun Watson's performance in both the Tennessee game and the Arizona Cardinals game didn't help the Browns blow those teams out. As if Deshaun Watson's performance in the first game of the season didn't help the Browns win. Right? Obviously, in all of the games that they won with Deshaun Watson, he was an important factor in all of this. But that's not the game they saw. They saw Deshaun Watson throw a pick six and then give up a fumble six against the Pittsburgh Steelers. And that painted their perception of him. Everything else was filled with highlights that they saw on the timeline while they weren't watching the game live, or, you know, stat sheets, right? Because you look at the stat sheets, it don't look impressive. Whether you watched it, it wasn't impressive, but it was certainly good enough to make us feel like the Browns had a real chance with him at the quarterback position. So how does he change that narrative? Right there. He's got to play well on national TV. Now, the good news for Deshaun Watson is that he's going to have plenty of opportunities to prove this. We got Myles Garrett, who's one of the biggest stars in the NFL. The Browns are going to get a ton of national TV games. They got big-time stars now in a big-time star in Myles Garrett. Nick Chubb's coming back. Everybody's going to want to see that. Kevin Stefanski's a two-time. Like, this team has cachet. They have shit you can sell to a national audience, right? That's been the problem. Why the Browns haven't gotten national TV games, although they have a big fan base, is, well, we don't got a lot to sell, right? Put the Browns on TV in like 2017, nobody wants to watch Deshaun Kaiser, right? But now people are interested. They're interested. They want to see Myles Garrett. They want to see Nick Chubb come back from his injury. They want to see this vaulted Browns defense. They want to see what the two-time coach of the year looks like. They're going to have a ton of national TV games this year. And if you're Deshaun Watson, it will behoove you, if you are interested in changing the narrative about you, to play well in those games, because as we've seen, those games paint the narrative. Think about every player that you like. Think about the moments that you like those players about. Well, like those players that they did. They're usually in national TV games. Odell Beckham's entire perception of a player is painted by one catch that he made on Sunday Night Football. Now, he has earned that reputation, especially in New York. But a lot of that was because he made that one catch on Sunday Night Football. Do you think he would have became the megastar that he is now, or was in that era, if he made that catch at 1 o'clock on a Sunday? Does it make the same waves? Probably something we see on Twitter, throw away the next day. But it happened at 8 o'clock. Everybody saw it. So we all got to debate, was that the best catch we've ever seen? How did he catch that? How did he do that, right? There's value in these national TV games. They change the narrative. Myles Garrett was able to win Defensive Player of the Year without leading the league in sacks, which something that we thought was impossible because the narrative was always going to favor TJ Watt. But this helped the Browns, right? Because TJ Watt got all them sacks at Sunday at 1 o'clock. Didn't nobody care about them sacks. This is at Sunday at 1 o'clock. Myles Garrett showed the national TV audience exactly how a player can dominate a football game without getting a single sack. on Thursday Night Football in front of everybody. That's the difference, right? That stuck with people all the way until they voted for that award. They saw that, they said, hey, Miles is Defensive Player of the Year, and he deserved it. But that's how it happens. That's how narratives form. It matters what you do on national TV. Hell, TJ Watt won his 2021 Defensive Player of the Year off of a 3-sack game that he had on national TV versus Baker Mayfield. How you play on national TV changes the perception that you have nationally. Because while locally we're all watching these games, nationally they're not. Those are the games that change the narrative. So for everybody who asks me, how does Deshaun Watson change that narrative? This is the answer. He's got to have some good national TV games. Think about this. How much differently do you think people would talk about Deshaun Watson's season if instead of that Pittsburgh game being on Monday Night Football, he has that game at M&T Bank Stadium on Monday Night Football? It would entirely change the perception of him. Like, it would almost change it entirely. We would be talking about how he played that game injured, how he played that game with a high ankle sprain and a broken shoulder, threw 14 for 14, and then won that game for the Cleveland Browns, which helped them make the playoffs later in the season. But it happened at Sunday when nobody else was watching. So it's just kind of a footnote. But that Monday night game, that's what the perception is, right? Interesting, isn't it? But that's how it goes. So that's how Deshaun Watson could change his perception in 2024. We'll see if he does that. But that's going to be what it takes. He's going to have to play well on national TV. And honestly, if the Browns want to change their perception, they're going to have to do that too. That's my thoughts. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. Y'all have a great day. Have a better night. Peace.